Congress MP Shashi Tharoor, who tried to bring in this private members bill. He made 2 attempts at it, and he joins us now. Mr. Tharoor, thank you very much for speaking to NDTV. And as we hear the 377 judgment, as we read it, it really reminds us of what happened with your private members bill.
Well, I welcome the decision, Sunetra, and I'm particularly gratified that the Supreme Court has ruled on the basis of the exact same arguments that I tried to make in Parliament, namely that 377 issue is not so much about sex as it is about freedom, about the constitutionally guaranteed freedoms to all our citizens for equality, for dignity, for privacy. I was already quite hopeful because of last year's right to privacy judgment, which was a landmark judgment. And I think this builds rightly upon that as well. It says the government has no place in our bedrooms, that essentially people's private consensual behavior as adults is their business and not that of the government. I think this is a very, very important development. In many ways it comes rather late. It's been about 50 years since such rulings were made in the Western democracies, but better late than never. And I would say that it's very good that finally the Supreme Court has done what Parliament shamefully was unable to do when I tried to introduce my private members' bills, and the BJP vociferously shouted them down and didn't even allow them to be introduced. So we've made a right step forward, I think, for freedom in our country.
Well, even hours after the judgment came, Mr. Tharoor, we didn't hear many politicians reacting to it. Why is that?
Well, unfortunately, you see, those who have been opposed in a bigoted way to the decriminalization of Section 377 have cloaked their positions in family norms in India, in religious morality and so on, which, to be very honest, are actually ill-founded in the cultural and historical context of our country. India is a country where there has always been space for alternative expressions of sexuality, where the LGBT community finds its own figureheads showing up in the ancient scriptures, epics, texts, and temple carvings. Why it is that a new morality introduced particularly in the British Victorian Code of the mid-19th century has so completely taken a hold of our people that they've become hesitant to accept that ours was historically a culture of much greater freedom than the British reduced it to in the colonial era. It astonishes me, but it's true. Political courage is not been very much evident on this issue. I must admit that when I tried to raise the bill, I had the backing of my then party president, Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, who supported it unreservedly. But many of my own party colleagues did not find it possible to attend to support me at that time. So it's very clear that for many, they feel that this is not their problem, it's not their issue, they don't want to be identified with it. And certainly when someone like me stood up to raise it, the kind of malicious hoots and cackles and sniggers and negative comments I got from the other side could make it very clear why no one was willing to stick their neck out. But fortunately, I had a very, very clear view on the matter. I believed it was one of a principle that related to constitutional freedoms, that related to the rights that every citizen of India ought to be able to enjoy, and it's from that perspective that I approached it. But for many of our politicians, they see it in a different light, and I'm sorry that if you, as you tell me, very few others have been willing to come forward and hail the Supreme Court verdict. I think that's a great pity.
Well, you know, one of the people who was there when you were trying to push through the private members bill, Nishikant Dubey, he told NDTV that it was sub judice matter at that time. Do you think in that sense there were many politicians who were really happy to let the court take the take the initiative for this, that they wanted to stay back, not do anything, and let the court be the one who takes the initiative in gay rights?
That is not what Mr. Dubey said in the Parliament debate. On the contrary, it wasn't at that point yet sub judice, and that the Supreme Court had not yet admitted either the curative review petition, which they did subsequently, nor had the Supreme Court begun hearings on this case, which it ruled on today. I introduced my bill first in December of 2015. This gentleman, who is now essentially lying to the media, opposed it on the grounds of what he claimed was the traditional family values of Indians. When I reintroduced the bill, it was in February of 2016. The same thing happened. It was only in March that the case became sub judice again, when the Supreme Court admitted the curative review petition. So my private member bills were introduced when there was no judicial process, where in fact the last word of the judiciary had been in December 2013, when the Supreme Court said that they would actually affirm the constitutionality of Section 377, and that it was up to the legislature to deal with this matter, not the judiciary, which is why I introduced the bill. It's only subsequently, after the failure of both my bills, thanks in no part to this gentleman who is now misrepresenting his position, it is only after that that the Supreme Court once again took up the matter. When I failed the second time, I publicly said, and I said this to the activist groups like the Naz Foundation and others that had approached me, I said that now it is very clear that as long as the BJP has a majority in this assembly, in this Lok Sabha, this will not find a legislative solution. It needs to go back to the judiciary. And it was on the basis of my setbacks that they went back to the Supreme Court. And I'm very pleased they did so, because I was right. You can't keep on trying the legislative route and losing, because as Einstein said, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is the definition of insanity. And I decided to keep myself sane by stopping those attempts. I said, let's leave it to the courts. And I'm very, very glad the courts have done what they have done. I think it's a very important step forward for Indian democracy and for the constitutional freedoms that all Indians should be able to take for granted, irrespective of their sexual orientation.
And as the flag bearer of gay rights, Mr. Tharoor, I have to ask you this before we let you go. Will gay marriage be your next private member's bill?
Well, look, let's all digest this good news and see, the fact is that the Supreme Court has been a very good voice for interpreting the existing constitutional freedoms in the light of evolving societal norms. So their decision in actually interpreting women's rights, for example, in a succession of court judgments, has given us a much more greater amplitude of rights for women in our society than earlier laws had. Similarly, it seems to me this could be the first of many other judgments that progressively expand freedoms for the LGBT community, but we also have to see how much society is willing to take. It was revealing that the government, when their final submission in this case, said that they would not take a position on the merits of the constitutionality of 377 and criminalization, and that they would leave it to the wisdom of the judges, but they added that the judges should not contemplate any additional steps because the government may have a different view. I think that's a clear warning that if the issue, for example, of gay marriage comes up, that the government may not be as willing to entertain such an issue, and they may actively oppose it. So I think it will be in the interests of all concerned to take things one step at a time, see how much society can absorb and move on. And I think, for one thing, since the LGBT community now can truly walk the streets with their heads held high without feeling in any way the judgment of society, the state, or the police upon them, let them enjoy that experience of normality and freedom in our society, and then let's aspire to the next step. I do think that inevitably we will also find ourselves going the way of most other democracies. We were out of step with the majority of democracies so far till today in the criminalization of private sexual behavior. That should now change, and with that, other changes could well follow.
Well, Shashi Tharoor, thanks very much for speaking to NDTV and standing up for equality and everyone's rights.